Hello everybody, can you hear me? Great stuff. Welcome to the annual FMJ Debate, and thank you for coming along today. I hope you'll be able to join us after the debate for some drinks and nibbles in the BIFM Networking Hub, which is just around the corner. I'm Cathy Hayward. I am Managing Director of the Facilities Management Communications Agency called Magenta, and I'm going to be chairing today's debate, which is sponsored by Moneypenny, so thank you very much to them. Let me introduce our panel today. On the far left we have Guy Stallard, who's speaking from the client's perspective. Guy is Head of Facilities for KPMG UK. He's a chartered accountant who has worked at KPMG since 1987. As Head of Facilities, Stallard is responsible for a property portfolio totaling 1.2 million square feet and for services into the offices with a delivery team of over 700 in-house and outsourced staff. He's a member of KPMG UK's Corporate Responsibility Leadership Committee, where there's a strategic focus on social mobility, the environment and the promotion of the living wage, which he does a lot of work on. Next to Guy, we have Caroline Reilly, who is from the Living Wage Foundation. Caroline is an employment support officer and manages the employer accreditation scheme for a growing network of 630 living wage employers. In November 2013, she led on the launch of a service provider recognition scheme together with the Living Wage Foundation. Caroline joined the foundation in February 2013 and has a background in project management, HR, operations and communications. Next to Caroline, we have CJ Howden, who is the Group HR Director at FM service provider Servest, who will be speaking from the HR perspective. CJ is so as she said, she's Group HR Director for Servest. She joined the HR team in August 2009 and was promoted to Group HR Director in April 2014. She's responsible for all people services within the UK, including HR advice, shared services, payroll, time and attendance. And she also provides leadership to the 40 staff working in people services functions. And finally, from the service provider's point of view, we have Richard Sykes, Managing Director of ISS. The business has a turnover in excess of 1.1 billion and over 47,200 employees from both public and private sectors. After graduating, Sykes joined Taylor Woodrow and worked on a number of Pathfinder PFIs before forming its FM business in the mid-90s. He then joined Carillion at the start of 2009 as MD for its services business and strategically grew and positioned Carillion as one of the market leaders in the services industry. And he took up his current role with ISS in 2004. So, on to today's question. We're debating the topic, are the prevalence of 0 hours contracts and the lack of a wider adoption of the living wage damaging the reputation and professionalism of the facilities management sector? Both the living wage and the issue of 0 hours have hit the headlines recently, and I'm sure you've all seen the headlines in The Guardian and the Evening Standard particularly. And a lot of them mention FM service providers who we know and their clients, and generally in a pretty negative light. The living wage, as I'm sure you all know, is a voluntary rate of pay designed to enable workers to afford a basic but acceptable standard of living. It's currently £8.80 an hour in London and £7.65 outside, compared to the national minimum wage, which will be £6.50 in October. Recent research from KPMG, carried out by Guy and his colleagues, reveals that there are now 5.24 million people being paid less than the minimum wage in the UK, which is actually an increase of about 400,000 from last year. And according to the Office for National Statistics, 450,000 cleaners and 370,000 catering assistants in the UK are paid less than the living wage. So this is a big issue for our sector. Meanwhile, 0 hours contracts is where a person is not contracted to work a set number of hours and is only paid for the number of hours they work. And some contracts, as you may know, actually prohibit an employee from working from competitors. They are used by many FM service providers for seasonal work and to iron out peaks and troughs in demand. And there are estimated to be about 2 million people in the UK working on a 0 hours basis, many within FM. Now, I'd like to start today by asking you, the audience, to vote on this particular topic. Please could you put your hands up if you think the prevalence of 0 hours contracts and the lack of the wider adoption of the living wage is damaging the reputation of the FM sector. So if you agree to the question, put your hands up. I say perhaps we've got about a third of the audience who are saying it is. And just to make sure we've got no absenteeisms, who thinks it isn't damaging the reputation? Put your hands up if you think it isn't. Maybe another third. So we've got a third who are undecided at this stage. So I'd like to open the debate by asking each of our panellists to answer the debate question. Are the prevalence of 0 hours contracts and the lack of a wider adoption of the living wage damaging the reputation and professionalism of the FM sector? So if we could start at the far end, start with Guy, and each panellist will just speak for 1 or 2 minutes, setting out their views on the topic.
Thank you, Cathy. In relationship to the question, I will separate 0 hours from living wage. Going on to living wage, from my perspective, the living wage is a way of actually making the FM sector sustainable, in the sense of having an industry where people do not earn enough through the day for working a long week to live on, leads to an industry that cannot have training, sustainability, and actually professionalise itself. So from my perspective, the living wage, the experience from KPMG implementing is that we get lower turnover of staff, higher quality, higher motivated staff. So from an FM contractor point, very attractive. From a client customer point of view, it gets to that position that we are getting the quality service that we're expecting from FM contractor. So for me, the living wage is a way for professionalising facilities on a sustainable basis. In terms of 0 hours, I'm a great supporter of 0 hours in terms of for seasonal work. Where I have concerns is where it's been used as analogous for a full-time contract, because the employer, i.e. a retail firm normally, has got clauses that stop person working for different providers, because a true 0 hours contract provides flexibility to the employee and flexibility to the employer. One with restricted covenants in place isn't a 0 hours contract. And similarly, I would say 0 hour contracts where the living wage is paid for the hour are themselves sustainable, as long as the employee, often students, is able to decide whether they do or don't take on the work.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Guy. Can I pass that along to Caroline to answer the same question? Thank you.
Thanks, Cathy. So our views from the Living Wage Foundation do echo those of KPMG in that, in terms of 0 hour contracts, we don't really have a voice in how we would like employers to use them, but we would expect the highest responsible or best practice is looked at them. They are flexible and there is a benefit to workers, but you also have to acknowledge where they are abused. We're looking for leadership. We're not concentrating on if it's damaging the reputation. I think the living wage applies to all organisations, all sectors, and that there are a large amount of workers earning less than living wage in the service areas. So that's an area that we need more leadership to be shown.
Lovely, thank you, Caroline. And on to CJ from the HR side of things.
Thank you, Cathy. I think from a HR perspective, in terms of whether 0 hours contracts are damaging our industry, I think they can do where employers are not using them in the appropriate way. So as Guy had said, where there's exclusivity clauses that are included in the contracts, it's really not in the true sense of how a 0 hours contract should be used. From an employer's perspective, it's great to have flexibility of a workforce, certainly where you have seasonal variations. But you know, we need to be as flexible with the employees as we're expecting them to be with us. So I think it's about how it's handled. From the living wage point of view, I think it's really important to recognise and reward the employees, and having a standard of living that they are able to work with is a fantastic thing to do.
Great stuff, thank you. And finally, on to Richard, talking from the service provider's perspective.
Thanks, Cathy. I think from my perspective, the 0 hours piece, it can be damaging to our industry, and I think is being damaging to our industry. You know, the recent comments that have been in the press around that probably demonstrate that. The fact that the Queen's speech recently announced that they will review 0 hour contracts was probably highlighting that the government are going to take some action. So I think there's an opportunity for us as an industry to stand up first, and maybe we should be banning the exclusivity across our sector and across our industry, and that's a first step that we could easily take together. And there are some flexibility concerns around that, but especially for some customers that do require some exclusivity. But if they do require that, then they should be putting people on contracts, in my mind. Coming back to the living wage, we certainly found that I think our industry is taking a lead around living wage, actually, and I think we're far ahead of some others. We can do more. We need more enlightened customers like KPMG to achieve that. We need procurement people to understand around sustainable procurement, so particularly the footprint we put into communities in the longer term. And if we can achieve that, then I think the FM industry can be a really leading light around living wage.
Okay, great stuff. Before I open to questions from the floor, so please start thinking them up. I'd like to put a question to perhaps Guy to start off with, which sort of leads on really from what Richard said there about enlightened customers. It's all very well if supply side organisations might want to pay the living wage, but if clients don't support it, then that makes that fairly difficult. Guy, you obviously from KPMG support the living wage. What's your experience from talking to your peers in other client-side organisations when you talk about this issue? Are they happy to support it, or what are their feelings if they don't want to support it?
Thanks, Cathy. Well, KPMG been on a long journey because the move to pay the living wage goes right back to 2006. At the time, I moved from being Deputy Director of Finance into Head of Facilities when London Citizens, which they then called the telco, came and raised the point of how can an organisation that has a large amount of highly paid employees treat the cleaners such that they're not paid a wage that they can live on. Then I went straight to the board and raised the moral point about where our responsibility is, and the board came back with a very straight point, which was we should be making sure that people who work for us have enough to live on. But then they added a big caveat: but your budget doesn't increase, you now need to go away and work out what are the drivers that sit behind your cost base and how can you restructure catering and cleaning contracts to effectively pay and reach a sustainable level. So with my contractors at the time and the subsequent ones, we have effectively restructured and now have a very highly motivated workforce to deliver the services we require. What do other organisations think? Well, there are now, and Cathy said 630 accredited employers, there are now 750. On the whole, enlightened employers are beginning to see the equality and quality benefits of paying employees properly result in getting better value from either direct employees, because there are large amounts of industries where direct employees may not be paid a living wage, or from their FM contracts. There are still out there a large amount of employers for which it's not on the list of criterion, but generally the feeling I'm getting, and there are now 10 FTSE 100 companies who are accredited as living wage employers, and it should soon be double that amount, that generally the direction of travel is that the UK business and the Living Wage Commission, on which I'll be a member, report next week, generally see supportive reaction to the concept of paying fairly. If an employer doesn't care about the quality of service, then they may go for a minimum wage contract. But experience, especially for small FM contractors, is that paying properly lets deliver a quality product which customers value. It enables contracts to be renewed, which in turn, in an industry with very small profit margins, helps the contractor base to become sustainable.
Great stuff, thank you. Now I'd like to open the question up to the audience. Does anybody have any questions they would like to put to any of our panel? Julie, I'll start with you.
Hiya, thank you. Richard, could I ask you a question, please, if you don't mind? Just picking up what Guy said, how do you reconcile when you have a client who wants to pay the living wage and you have a service provider who may say, well, that's okay, folks, but we can't do that across all our sites, so we want you to keep it quiet?
Good question. It is difficult, but it's something that we have across our business, as you know. We don't have all of our contracts on living wage yet, but we are in a process of persuading all our customers to move to living wage. What we have to do is ring fence that location, and that's what we have to do in terms of the legalities of that, and say that's the location where we're paying living wage, that's what the work that's carried out at that location, and unfortunately it's slightly different across the road with a different customer, but that we have to ring fence that particular location legally, and that's how legally it works, and that's what we have to implement. I think it's a very good question in terms of then the problem we get as an employer is the people on the other side now want to transfer to the one that's got a higher wage. And we do get a lot of that. So you tend to find that the customers that are taking the living wage on attract the better staff, have the better service and have the better quality. And that's where Guy's angle is around how they sustain their performance in their business. So that's why we then go back to the other customers and start trying to persuade them, tell them the journey and explain it. And that's when we get it catching in an area. Is that okay?
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Who would like to put a question to our panel?
Thank you. This one's for all the panellists, I think. I think many of us will be broadly supportive of the living wage, but we do have a mechanism in this country to define minimum standards in terms of payments to employees, and that's the national minimum wage. I wondered whether people felt what their views were about the desirability of using the national minimum wage to actually lift it towards the living wage as a mechanism to get there.
Okay, I've got the mic, so I start. I think that will happen, for sure. I think the gap is narrowing, and it will continue to narrow, and at some stage it will make absolute sense to scrap one or the other, and we've got living wage here, let's just call it living wage, and get rid of the national minimum wage. It seems ludicrous to have two different levels, and one is being led by employers and providers, and the others are kind of government minimum. We need to really narrow that gap and just have one, in my mind.
I'm not going to be controversial at all and just completely agree with everything that Richard's just said. I think we will end up with one consistent living wage, and if we recognise that that's the wage that's needed for people to live effectively, then that's the one we should have, in my view.
I guess the Living Wage Foundation's view on the national minimum wage is that we believe in a stronger national minimum as well as the living wage in place, so that those who can pay better do, and those who are working with the legal floor are slowly going to get there eventually. The pressure to lift the national minimum wage is a result of the endemic in-work poverty research that is ongoing at the moment, and it is inevitable that government will have to react, but we're non-partisan and support those who can pay better to do it.
I'll try and get a balance for what the criteria are. Obviously, the living wage is a calculation of what person needs to have to actually be able to live, whereas the minimum wage is a calculation of the amount of a consensus between effectively business, the unions and the low pay commission in relationship to the amount of money they think the economy can afford without there being any loss of employment. What we have to take account of is, and it's why it's a legal flaw, there are certain, say, locations, parts of Northern Ireland, where cost bases are lower than averaging. So there is that sort of tension. What is very clear is that government feels the minimum wage is not enough. George Osborne's very, very clear in his mind that he would like a minimum wage starting with a 7, and therefore what the government is very conscious of is that having a minimum wage and working tax credits that have to boost up people's salaries is not the right way you would start with, because in the end of the day, respect and dignity happens if someone actually earns a relevant wage rather than the fact they get a low wage and the government top up.
Just following up on that, I was talking to one public sector body who is introducing London Living Wage to their employees, and as a result they're going to go from about 360 part-time cleaners to about 100 full-time cleaners on the London Living Wage. And a lot of those cleaners obviously be made redundant. How do we, obviously this is a long-term, a positive move, but short-term is a great deal of pain both for the organisation and the employees involved. How do we get through that and get out to the bright light of everyone being paid a living wage? Because a lot of organisations will go through similar models.
I'll start by saying that KPMG also went through that change in 2006, where part of the thing was looking at how we were structuring contract, and we had got a large amount of part-time cleaners working 2 or 3 hours doing the job and then going on to the next job on buses or whatever they've been transferred around. That was not giving the individual a career. There was often hours that didn't suit the person, so it's about actually dignity and everything else. Now, structurally, there can be winners and losers in the short term on a micro level, but on a macro level, what happens is the right position, and also in the local community. So that actually was also known, and this is why a lot of councils are changing. If you boost wages at the low level in a local community, those individuals themselves spend the money because they don't save it, and actually boost the local economy. But there can be changes. All I would say, the public sector has got to the position it should have done in that case. The question was, how did it get into itself in the wrong operating model in the first place, and it's just a change situation.
Would anyone else like to comment on that?
I think we see that an awful lot, where we are introducing living wage. We are going through restructure programs. I think a lot of the introduction and cementing the living wage is around education of customers. So I think where they are educated around what can be done differently, it is easier to bring in the living wage. It is tough in those early days where you are restructuring, where people's roles are at risk. But I think long term, as Guy has said, the benefits far outweigh anything short term pain.
Yeah, I just think there's a danger that when we talk about the living wage, that we then link that to redundancies and use that as an excuse. So I don't see that at all. And I think the government back off that in terms of believing that if they raise it too high, then there's going to be a huge amount of unemployment. I just don't buy that at all. I think businesses will find other ways to get that efficiency.
Okay, great stuff. I'd open up any questions from the floor for our panellists around these issues.
Yeah, this is a question for the panel in general, and it's about how the increases in the living wage are calculated, and can they go, I think they do actually go above inflation rate, and how do you contractually address those so that basically the price of the service grows proportionally to the growth of living wage?
The living wage is, there are two rates. The London rate is calculated by the economics unit, which works for the GLA mayor. It's got a plinted criteria in relationship to the rate. Similarly, Loughborough University calculate the outside London rate. They are always announced on November. Firms that are accredited by the Living Wage Foundation commit to move to that rate within 6 months of the rate being announced. In terms of contracts, what my contract says with ISS and others is that we will move to paying to any increase in the living wage. Ours is within the month of being increased, and this is effectively acknowledged as a cost that will come back to me in terms of the contract and how it's been set up.
Thank you.
Well, one quick question: what are the challenges, perhaps one for Richard and CJ, of implementing the living wage? And Richard's talked a little bit about how to encourage clients to implement it and the benefits of doing it. But what are the challenges of doing it, and how can we address those?
Some of the challenges have been really awareness of the benefits. So when we talk to our customers, a lot of them aren't really aware of the benefits they're going to get out of this, and it's a win-win solution, as we say. They don't understand the piece around how this really does empower their workforce and make a real difference to the service provision. But you have to really walk them through that. Some of the challenges I said earlier is getting the procurement guys to really understand that it's not about driving the price right down to the bottom level, and really think about the service provision levels. We've just recently implemented living wage, probably one of the first London hotels, which is, I'm going to have to plug this, aren't I now? Just outside, which is the ISS Sunborn Yacht, so I can do all the cheap rates if you want to stay a night in the hotel, just out there on the left. But it is a serious issue, and I think just avoiding it is probably part of the key thing we've got to get through. You've got to get people to address it, stand up to it, really be bold around it, and I think the FM industry certainly could take a lead in that regard.
Any further questions from our audience for the panel? Anything at all? One quick question I have is around, there's been a lot of stuff in the press, particularly about universities, for example, which moved to pay living wage to direct employees, but not for contractor staff, which I guess sends out the message that contractor staff and FM outsourcing is generally they're less valuable as employees or as staff members. And several universities have faced strike action around this. How does the panel feel about organisations differentiating in this way?
So it's great that 150 universities around the country are going to implement the living wage, but that's to their definition only. So that's the reason why we're a body that has terms and conditions of how far that stretches to, and that has to be throughout your supply chain, so that the living wage brings everybody on them premises together and are treated with people at the core of everything that they do. So in terms of this, we do have universities that are accredited, and we're looking to for them to show leadership and show an example of what responsible employment is, and hopefully they'll be able to communicate that throughout the universities.
I wrote a tweet at the time, which was I thought it was morally repugnant because they were actually differentiating between outsourced FM staff and direct employees, and that differentiation doesn't exist. You should outsource because you haven't got the skills to deliver the service inside, not as a way of cutting cost. And actually, it was a deal between the unions and management that took it away. And otherwise, all you would have in the end is that anything that's difficult we outsource, and the FM industry will be seen not as a professional body but as a dealing with low paid staff who you don't feel are really part of your organisation.
I'll just add to that. The typical calls that I get are from your end users, I guess, wanting to be accredited, and it does shock them to learn that actually I do have to include my contractors within the accreditation in order to get the recognition for it. And it's the accreditation model is changing that culture of thinking about everybody as one. So I think it does lead to improvement for everybody with the accreditation in mind.
And does that just sort of reflect general organisations' views on FM, that it's kind of not part of us, so there's sort of this Cinderella profession that comes along at night and makes everything sparkling clean, and we don't really need to think about them or talk about them as an industry?
Yes, I think you're right, Cathy. I think there is where you have organisations and customers that aren't working in a true partnership approach with their provider, that's where you have this disparity. It's really, really important that those employees that are on our customers' sites feel very much part of the team, and they work much more effectively if they are.
Is there any final questions from the panel before we wrap up? Just one final question on the 0 hours. We talked a lot about living wage, but not a great deal about 0 hours. And Richard mentioned at the beginning that perhaps removing the exclusivity clause would be one step forward and have sort of wider acceptance. And of course, there are benefits for both employers and employees being on 0 hours contracts. What else could we do to make them more palatable to the industry and also to the press? Because there's been a lot of stuff in the press about 0 hours and generally negative context.
I think banning the exclusivity is a start, but it's only a step. I think we need a code of conduct really around how you use 0 hour contracts, and that'll probably take a long step in terms of giving people a bit more reassurance about how they're being used and in what way and how it benefits those individuals.
When you're talking about 0 hours contracts, I always think very rarely actually do companies use them in the true sense of a 0 hours contract. The reality of it is that the legislation in our country provides for if somebody has worked a consistent amount of hours over a period of time, they essentially have a contract anyway. And if an employer is aware of that, they will know that you can't just chop and change and decide someone will work for you for a period of time on a consistent basis and then all of a sudden lay them off. And I think that is where the negativity around 0 hours contracts is coming, and that's where employers must take responsibility for operating them in the true sense of a 0 hours contract format.
Okay. Oh, final word from Guy.
Yeah, I think the issue on 0 hours contracts is actually where retail are using them, not as the FM industry does, because actually what retail often have is, say, people who've got a 4-day working week job, and they call it 0 hours rather than actually giving them a 28-hour week contract and say if we need you to do extra hours it'll be overtime up to 35. So it's in many ways I'd say for some industries it's become lazy HR rather than actually a conscious decision around it. It's just it's either full-time or 0 hours, not actually we've got part-time contracts in the middle.
Great stuff. Well, as we're running out of time, I'd like to wrap up the debate and have a final vote from our audience. So could I ask you to put your hand up if you agree with the question, are the prevalence of 0 hours contracts and the lack of a wider adoption of the living wage damaging the reputation and professionalism of FM? If you think they are, could you put your hand up, please? So I think we're losing numbers here. And if you think that they are not damaging the reputation, could you put your hands up? And we still have a few people who are abstaining as well. But I think overall there is a general perception perhaps they are damaging the reputation. I'd like to thank very much our panel for coming along today, and to you, the audience, and also to invite you round for some drinks and nibbles in the BIFM Networking Hub round the corner, which is sponsored by Moneypenny. Thank you very much.